Building wealth for the future is important, but an increasing number of people want investments that do more than make money. The human impact on our environment calls for changes in the way society and industry operates. Investing with these issues in mind is what we call investing with conscience, or socially responsible investing. This approach looks to do social and environmental good, as well as achieve financial returns. For investors who care about the wider impacts of their investments, socially responsible investing also looks to make a better world for everyone.
Hello everyone and welcome to this session. I'm Sebastian Payne, the FT's Whitehall editor, and we are here to discuss pensions for young people. Folks of my generation, they will fear about what's going to happen when they're able to retire. They look with lots of envy at older people with their defined benefit pension schemes, which appear to be closed to us. Now, if all that sounds like jargon that you don't quite understand, then I'm very pleased to be joined by two of the FT's most expert voices on this, who will try and unpack all of the questions about pensions for young people and crucially try and answer how we can get a fairer deal. We have the FT's consumer editor Claire Barrett and our global pensions correspondent Joe Cumbo. Now, I am not going to confess to be able to answer many of your questions, but these two can. So please do join in, send in as many questions and we'll get through them as possible. Now, I'm going to begin with a little bit of a confession here that pretty much at the end of last year, I knew nothing about pensions. I knew they were there. I'd heard of the workplace entitlement thing, and Claire got in touch with me and said, would you like to write something about the fact about what's going on with your pension? And I was like, well, I could, but I have no idea what's going on. Claire offered me the most amazing advice to take advantage of the FT's, it turns out, quite generous pension scheme, and I now have something that might exist in the future in many years' time whenever I'm eventually able to retire. But that's not the case for many young people. So Claire, if you could just begin by kicking us off, what is the problem here and how has this developed?
Well, I think part of the problem, Seb, is the word pension, because you hear that and you think pensioner. And if you're somebody in your 20s, in your 30s, even in your 40s, you have the feeling that, you know, this retirement is a long way off. This whole concept of retirement, you know, the golden age, going on cruises, it's not something that you necessarily want or buy into. And you think, well, money is so tight, I'm saving up for a property deposit, I'm not earning very much. Maybe you're self-employed. Obviously, it's much harder for the self-employed to save towards pensions. And you kind of think, you know, this isn't for me. And nobody, whether that's at school or at university or even really in the workplace, ever spells out the advantages of pensions. So those of you who are listening, who are working for a company, you've got a big advantage here, because this was the thing that I told Seb about. If you work full-time for a firm or part-time, you've got a permanent contract, they, by law, have to enrol you, if you earn above a certain amount, into the company pension scheme. And depending on what company you work for, it may be more or less generous, but certainly most of them nowadays involve some degree of what's called matched contributions. So your first route to understanding pensions is those two words, matched contributions. Now, that means you pay in something from your gross salary and your employer will match it. Now, it could be 3%, it could be 4%, could be 6%, could be higher. Now, most employers will let you choose the percentage and they'll match it up to a certain level. And this is what had caught you out, Seb, because you didn't realise that actually you could go all the way up to 6%, where I think it's defaulted to start at about 2 or 3%. Now, the second thing is that could cost you, in terms of what ends up in your pay packets, a lot less than you think, because the other great secret to pension saving is that whatever you put into your pension is just skimmed off from your gross pay. You're not paying any tax on that money. So if you are a basic rate taxpayer, you earn less than 50k a year, basically paying 80 pence into your pension, paying £1 into your pension is going to cost you 80 pence, because you're not having to pay the tax. If you took that money into your salary, 20% tax would be deducted. Now, it gets even better the more you earn. If you are a higher rate taxpayer, so you earn more than £50,000 a year, it's going to cost you 60p to pay that pound into your pension because you're not paying 40% income tax on it. Now, if you consider that when that money is in your pension, growing over time, it can also grow tax-free. The other great wonder of pension saving and investing in general is compound interest. So if you start when you're young, even if you're putting quite small amounts of money away consistently every month, every year, you're getting, number one, the employer's contribution, number two, the benefit of tax relief, and number three, the benefit of that money growing tax-free over time. Now, of course, the big caveat is when you do come to take money out of your pension, you will pay some tax on it then. But nevertheless, that in a nutshell explains why pension saving over the long term is a tax-efficient, great use of your money. You get big bang from your buck and that uplift from your employer. Now, one final thing I'd say, if you're at a job interview and you get to the stage at the end where the employer says, is there anything you would like to ask us? Always, always, always say, what are the terms and conditions of your company pension? What are the match contributions? Because it is a part of your pay. Now, there's huge variation between different newspapers, journalists I know, the different schemes that Fleet Street offers, any sort of company. It's going to be the same. So really do your homework, ask people there, because, you know, we could be talking about, you know, 10, 15% of your pay as the pension at the most generous companies. But I hope that's given you a little feeling of less confusion.
Well, thank you very much, Claire. And I think part of this, actually, as you said, comes down to the changing nature of work for lots of younger people as well, because the fact many more people are either in many different occupations, not necessarily in those longer term careers. The idea of building up a pension pot seems quite a remote thing. In my circumstance, I've worked for 3 employers over the past decade, and I'm in the worst situation, which you will shake your head at, which is I think I now have 3 bits of pension pots scattered all over the place. I'm sure that's the case for many people in my generation. Now, Jill, I want to bring you in. I'm very sorry to hear from Claire the word pensions is not a good one, that considering it's your job title and what you do, that's not exactly the best start. But give us your view on how we got to this situation of a bit of a raw deal for younger people. What's happened between the generations?
Thank you very much, Seb, and thank you very much, Claire, for that intro. And I think you would have got a flavour of just how complex and confusing pensions can be, but you've got some expert tips there from Claire. And I think that really condenses the problem for young people today, is that the pensions that they are saving into are far riskier and less generous than the pensions of their parents 2 decades ago. 20 years ago, and I'm sure you've got people who are in the audience who are in their 20s and 30s, if their mums and dads and their uncles would have retired in the private sector, and they still are doing so in the public sector, with a guaranteed pension that paid them an income for life and then carried on paying to their married partner and their beneficiaries if they had children up until the age of about 20. So those kind of pensions, these gold standard defined benefit pensions, they don't really exist anymore because they've become too unaffordable for employers to back, but they really were good in the sense that they delivered a pension and you could sleep at night knowing the worry of making sure that money was going to be paid from month to month was not yours, it was your employer's. Now, in contrast, people going into the workplace today, Seb, anyone else, mainly under 40, would be enrolled into these riskier defined contribution schemes where you have to make all the investment decisions. Once you get to retirement, you then have to make the decisions about making that money last. Now, with these pensions, unlike the pensions that your parents had, you don't know how much money you're going to get when you retire or how to make that last. Now, there are a few people who might be capable and willing to make those decisions about how to save, how much to save, and how to invest, and then how to turn that money into an income. But most people aren't very good at doing that efficiently and effectively. It's a lot of hassle, and you need to keep on top of it. So what we are proposing with our new deal for the young people is to, instead of people saving into individual accounts with all the burden of making the savings decisions, investment decisions, and making that money turn into an income for life, isn't borne by the individual, it's borne by the collective. Now, the benefits of the collective pension scheme is that they do the heavy lifting of making investment decisions, not you, while you're trying to raise your family, save for a house, etc. You've got a lot on your plate. And then you get to retirement, and that will pay you a pension for life. I'm going to just give you a couple of numbers just to illustrate the mountain that young people have to climb today. The average defined benefit pension people have is around £6,000 a year. That's perhaps the parents who have retired with that. Now, for you as a young person to try and replicate that income, which will pay a pension to your spouse and rise with inflation, you'd need to save around £250,000 to £300,000 to buy that same pension. For most people, that's completely out of range today, because they're not saving enough and they're not making best investment choices, and then they can't make that money last when they get to retirement. Collective pensions take some of that lifting off the individual. The risk is shared. In that sense, they give the young a better hope of a decent retirement like their parents.
Joe, I just want to come back to you quickly on this. Is a really interesting question about the balance between the individual and how this works. Has there been a particular shift in recent years on this? Because obviously, as Claire mentioned, we saw the introduction of workplace pensions over recent years, which seem to have a little bit of more of that collective shift there. But what you're proposing would go significantly beyond that.
Yeah, so over the last 20 years, what we've seen is a shift from the paternalism of the company pension, where the employer and the pension scheme really took on the responsibility of making sure that that money was invested for you, and then making sure it paid you for the rest of your life. It was your wage for life. What's happened? That model has been dying out right across the world. Employers have not been wanting to take on that burden because of the costs and regulation. So the dial has swung completely in the opposite direction. The burden, the investment risk, the longevity risk has been landed on individuals. So it's financial individualism. And what the evidence is showing from around the world is that most people aren't really good enough at making those decisions. So what we're proposing and what we've seen is a model that has been operating in Holland, for example, and Canada in variations. It's called collective defined contribution. So it's where all people save together in a big mega fund, and the fund takes on the risk. So it's not at the extreme end of financial individualism. It's not completely paternalistic, but it's a halfway house. It's a third way, which has the potential to deliver higher incomes than individuals could do saving on their own.
Well, Claire, and this comes back to what we were just saying before about this changing nature of work. Because if you think of, those big old paternalistic British companies like ICI, for example, you join there in your 20s, you retire and get a golden carriage clock when you're 65. And on the top of that, you have a nice chunky pension scheme at the end of it as well. Do you think the idea of what Joe is talking about, people would engage with that? Because I think one thing, obviously, you write a lot about in your columns in the FT Weekend is about financial education here. And it's something that we definitely still struggle with in this country. And it feels as if getting people engaged in pensions is tough, particularly when you're in your 20s. And it's something that might be 40 years in the future as well. Obviously, some people can feel that it's just too complex or it's not immediate enough now. But if you're going to have this kind of big scheme, collectivized scheme that Joe has been talking about, you've got to convince and explain to people why that's important.
Well, certainly you have. And I asked my followers on Instagram last week if they could tell me in a word how they felt about pensions. Now, I made the resulting response into a word cloud for you, where the predominant words are the biggest ones. And you can very clearly see, confused is in there, fleeced, arg, that was me, letter about tax limits, which I just didn't understand, could have been written in Sanskrit, shafted, that was an older lady who'd lost
Fleeced
out
is
on
an
her
interesting
state pension.
one there, because fleeced somehow suggests that there's some corporate entity that's either not giving you a good deal or taking money away from you. That all the others are, I think, what you might expect.
Yeah, fleeced was somebody who had been charged very high fees on a a plan to pay them a pension in retirement that they'd organised through a financial advisor, because this is part of the problem that we're getting to. So if you're somebody who's reading the FT, let's imagine that you're probably somebody who's earning a bit more than the average person. So problem number one for you is solved, which is having enough money to actually set aside to invest for the future, whether that's within a pension or within other things like ISAs. But problem number two is then, what do you do with it? Now, most company schemes, you're defaulted into saving through this great policy called auto-enrollment, which has benefited many 20 and 30-year-old people in the workplace. But then again, within that, it's put into what's called a default fund, because if everybody had to make a decision on the first day in their first job, what do you actually want your pension to be invested in? Most of us, and I say myself included, on the first day I started work at the FT, if you said to me, what exactly would you like your pension to be invested in? We're just not in a position where we're able to give an answer. So the default fund for most companies is, it's a bit of everything. It's got bonds, it's got equities, it's got exposure to infrastructure assets in some cases. It will be spread around the world. It won't just be limited to the UK. Whereas if you had to sort of think about picking some shares, you might think, oh, Marks and Spencer's, or, oh, another brand I've heard of. And it wouldn't be very diversified. It wouldn't be a very good idea. So most people are kind of nudged into what will be an okay choice. But if you want to engage more, find out what's in your pension, maybe you're motivated through an environmental consciousness. That's become a really big trend in the last few years. People saying, well, is my company pension being invested in carbon intensive industries, in fossil fuels, because I don't want that to happen. The pension providers have had to really respond to that and become more transparent. But nevertheless, you've got to make a choice. You may also choose to invest in additional pensions, a SIP, a self-invested personal pension. They are very, very popular in the UK. Now, Seb, that's one thing that you could consider doing with your old company pension pots that you've got scattered around the place. Certainly you don't need to do that, because they're still invested within the stock market, those pensions. They're still performing for you. The thing that you do definitely need to do is to make sure that your pension providers know that you moved house recently, because otherwise you could lose track of those pensions, and you really want to know where they are. If you want to consolidate them into a SIP so that you can make your own investment choices, maybe look at the fees, see if you can do any better for yourself, you can do that. But I'm conscious of the fact that as I'm talking about these things, there may be a lot of people at home who are thinking, confused, I can't do this without an advisor holding my hand. And of course, advisors cost money. And for that reason, we think that fewer than 1 in 10 people in the UK, adults of working age, ever see a financial advisor. So as Joe said, it's very much down to luck, whether you're prepared to invest your own time in understanding these kinds of things. And even if you do that, there's still obviously the potential to make a poor decision. And the fact that you can get your money out at the age of 55, which is pretty early in my view, if you're potentially going to live to 100, when you can get your own hands on the cash, as many people want to, there's lots of pressure on people to use that money to help their families, to maybe, pay down other debts. These were all uses that were really never intended for pensions. It's always intended to be there for when you can no longer earn money to support yourself. But before you all feel too depressed, just look at the situation when you're older. Now, I said earlier that concept of retirement, is really being eroded. And Martin Wolf made some very interesting comments in a session yesterday about how he thinks people working into their 70s will become the norm. Now, of course, the big caveat to this is that there are lots of professions where you just couldn't work into your 70s. Physical labour, if you weren't strong enough. Teaching is another one. People have said, try being a classroom teacher at the age of 70. Good luck with that. But increasingly working for longer and working part-time for longer, if employers overcome this current problem of ageism, that is going to be one way that people can have more income in retirement. You've got the state pension, which is what you get through your national insurance contributions, although the age at which you get that is steadily increasing. Then you've got your private pensions, whatever you manage to save up there. Increasingly, people who are in their 60s and 70s today are using equity release in a really big way. That's when they've built up housing equity. House prices have, of course, risen dramatically over the past 20 or 30 years. I think it's only really this generation that will be able to make use of that money. So that will kind of be their get out of jail free card, if you like, for pension savings. And then beyond that, could you use your pension? Could you use your property in other ways? Like renting out rooms. I know some older people where I live who are doing that. Could you have savings within stocks and shares ISAs, which are another brilliant tax efficient way of saving for the future? So most people are not going to have that one final salary, like a salary payment going in from their employer, but depending on their level of engagement, their ingenuity, and also, frankly, to a degree, luck, they have lots and lots of different ways that they could fund a retirement.
Well, I'm just going to let Joe come in here on this fleecing question, because I want to move Joe on this question of what are the pros and cons of different options that we've got going on at the moment for younger people, and what's best before looking at this wider question of reform here. So do you want to come in on the fleecing question?
Yeah, I just wanted to sort of support what Claire was saying there about how people end up getting fleeced. It's not too hard to make a bad decision when you don't know what you're doing. There is a culture here in this country, the UK, and around the world increasingly to get people to load them with the responsibility of making investment decisions when they're really not equipped to do that. Hence, they can get fleeced because they don't understand charging structures and they don't understand the significance of small differences in percentages, which can erode and gouge your earnings and your pot over the course of 10 or 20 years. So things haven't really been helped for savers with pensions because not all charges are transparent. So it's very difficult for an ordinary saver to get a good deal. And that's why I think that we do need to think about what we can do to get a better deal for the young, who are being landed increasingly with all this sort of necessity to be financially very, very savvy, with products which are still quite complex.
Yeah, now let's look at various things that you can do. So obviously we've talked about auto enrollment, which is great, and I think most people I know who have at least thought about their pensions will be on that, and who are in the circumstance that they can. But what other things have we got, Joe, at the moment, and where would you nudge people into looking at in terms of looking at lifetime ISAs or other kinds of saving?
Claire's made some really excellent points about your approach to pensions and what you should do. I think the very first thing you should do is absolutely check if you're employed, if you're making the most of the pension contributions, that the deal that is on the table from your employer. Now, I've heard, even in my own experience at the FT with colleagues, saying, well, I don't want to pay the maximum because I can't afford it. And I said, well, you're walking away from free money on the table because the employer matches what you pay in. Do you want to walk away from money on the table?
Claire made that very argument to me.
Yeah, it is a basic point. Now, let's face it, Seb, if you've got a challenge of saving 250 to 300K to get a decent amount of income in 40 years, you need to start early and you need to make sure you're not missing a trick with what's going on. So I would definitely make sure that I'm saving enough, saving regularly. And there's also the lifetime ISA, which is another opportunity for people to save, for young people to save for a home and for retirement. But you have to think about whether the employer, I would ask the employer whether they would actually pay more into my pension. Now I'm moving into another area, into a policy area, but I think it's a case to argue for employers perhaps to consider paying more into pensions than they do for older workers, say for the under 30s, just to give them the leg up that they need, because the money that goes into the pension earlier benefits from compounding as it grows. So it's really important not to neglect. When your focus might be on, for example, paying off debt or building up the deposit for a house, that's when I think the employer thinking a little bit more creatively about remuneration might be helpful.
Now, I just want to come on some of the questions that we've started to get coming before we move on to some of the other themes, and please do keep sending them in. I think this first one is going to certainly be for you, Claire, which is, how do you convince employers to put more younger people into pension pots? Most large companies and smaller ones have slashed pension contributions, moving from DB to DC, and in some cases to basic minimum levels under the auto enrollment, all of which means you don't end up with really any adequate thing, and you're in the situation Joe's just talked about, where you're putting money in, but you're not saving that bulk of money you really need to be able to live on when you retire.
Yeah, well, I think this all comes down to awareness of people about pension savings, because as Joe said, you know, it's a lot of money that's there on the table. And I often think, is it that employers don't want to give us the maximum amount of that free money, that they don't have kind of like, you know, posters around the building saying, if you paid more into your pension, we would give you more money in your salary? As if you put it like that, then most people are going to say yes. I mean, there used to be this fantastic guy who worked at the FT, who Joe knows very well, called Martin Bryce, long-standing sub-editor, nitpicker, and favourite of the personal finance section. And he used to say to people, this is in the days before auto-enrolment, answer me this question: do you want to be paid more? And of course, everyone's going to say yes. You know, so it's really kind of turning the question on its head. As to whether employers would pay more, I'll refer you to my earlier answer about when you are in the situation of a job interview or looking for firms that you might work for. It's very, very rare for people to ask, what is the pension scheme? Naturally, all of my children have asked it at their job interviews, because I've been saying, text me after the interview and tell me what the pension scheme is, because it really does make a big difference. And it's only really until employers think, well, we've been shamed because that person has said no to a job here because the rival down the road, you know, is offering twice the pension contributions, that it's really going to filter back to boards and filter back to HR departments. But there normally is that swing factor in that you can choose to pay in more if you want to, and then the company will pay in more. Now, if you were thinking about this like a shopper, is the other thing, that tax relief I was talking about earlier, because that is very valuable no matter what the employer is putting in. If you think about buying a top and it says 40% off, is that going to make you want the item more? Or even if it's 20% off, because that's effectively the deal that you're getting when you're using money from your gross salary to pay into your pension. It's costing you less than you'd think to put that money in. And if you're getting stuff from the employer on top of that, then it's an even better deal. Final tip, you can find calculators online where you can work out exactly what will happen to the bottom line of your pay packet, you know, what you actually take home in your bank account if you increase your pension contributions. And because of the effects of all of those things, paying a lot more money into your pension really may cost less than you might think. And it's well worth doing a few calculations to see what the benefits to you could be if you did pay in a bit more.
Well, there's a very good question that's come in. I'm going to put to you, Joe, which is making you a human calculator for a moment, which somebody has asked, how much would you recommend you should have saved in your pension pot by the time you are 30? I think that's a very interesting question, because I guess 30 is that point at which lots of people are settled within their careers. You're starting to often think to more towards family life and, of course, the future, and then, of course, that stability. So that is definitely a turning point where I think financial prudence starts to kick in.
That's a very difficult question to answer, because I think it comes.
What it might be.
I'm not trying to duck that, but the way to think about it is, do you want to retire? How much do you want to retire with? And there is a benchmark sort of ratio of 2/3 of your salary. Once you've got in mind how much you're earning, then you can roll back and then work out how much you need to save per month. But bear in mind, I always think it's a bit dangerous banding around numbers today, given that that market is going to be sort of 30 to 40 years' time, you might need to retire. But the key thing that you need to bear in mind, that should be at the top of your minds, is if you're 25 today or 30, that your life expectancy, according to the ONS, you have a 1 in 4 chance as a female of living to 97, 1 in 10 chance living to 100 and older. So if you want to have a hope of putting your fluffy slippers on by the time you're 75 and quitting work. You need to continue saving at least 10% to 15% of your salary today. And that can be made up from your own contributions and a contribution from your employer and the benefit of tax relief. But I would say you need to start saving as much as you can, as early as you can. That's if you're employed. The self-employed, we probably have questions dedicated to them. They've got an even tougher mountain to climb because they won't be getting the employer contribution. So they definitely need to think about starting sooner in terms of how much they're putting into their pensions, or at least making some provision for retirement.
Thanks very much, Joe. Now, before I do want to come to you both to ask about some of the reforms to the pension system you touched on earlier, but I just want to take a couple more quick questions. And Claire, this issue, we're getting a lot of stuff in about freelancers and self-employed here. You know, we've got one question's come in saying, many young people change jobs frequently, jumping from auto-enrollment pension scheme to pension scheme. Is there a danger maybe these contributions will be lost or forgotten? So that's one thing that we talked about. And you did say earlier that they are still there ticking away, but you've got to make sure your contact details are up to date. But I think this freelance and self-employed question is really tough, and I think particularly as we're coming out of the pandemic and people who are working from job to job and doing different kind of gigs, you can see how pensions rapidly fall down the level of priority when you're just trying to get an income and just try to survive at the moment.
Yeah, and I think, you know, considering the fact, Seb, that we have around 5 million people now in the UK who are working in the so-called gig economy, which is this sexy name that politicians love to slap on a sector which really doesn't have anything sexy about it at all. You know, it's very insecure employment. Now, if you are self-employed, you will know, as a result of the pandemic experience, how fragile cash flow can be, and the need to have quite a big cash buffer built into your business. Now, the basic problem for most people with pensions is that if you pay money into a pension, it is locked away until you are in your mid to late 50s, depending on how old you are. You can't get your hands on that money. That is why you're given all of these advantages of tax relief, because the government is trying to incentivize us to save for the future. But you just run across this big roadblock with self-employed, that to risk having that valuable cash locked up is just too great a risk for many people, so they don't save. Now, slightly in contrast to something Joe said earlier about how much you should save into a pension, I would advocate that even if you can only afford to save a small amount, you know, get started. And the same goes for the self-employed. If you can build it into your plan so that you do have a cash buffer and you do have something that you're putting into a pension, however small, then definitely do that. But also work out what you've got. Many people will be employed for a period of time and then they will go into self-employment. So keeping track of those pensions, working out what you want to do with them. The financial world is coming out with a lot of app-based solutions targeting more affluent self-employed people. There's an app that lots of my followers on Instagram are very enamored with, which is called Penfold, which helps self-employed people easily organize a pension, because one thing that you don't have a lot of if you're running your own business, of course, is time. So that's one company that's trying to target that market. You've also got companies like PensionsBee who are trying to help people consolidate lots of pension pots into one thing. The only thing I'd say about those is, you know, if they are doing a lot of the legwork for you in terms of like the annual fee that they're going to charge you, it's going to be reflected in that. So just go into these kinds of things with your eyes open. But also the under 40s. Now, the lifetime ISA, if you're under 40, you can use that a bit like an alternative pension. If you want to get your money out in an emergency, you could, although you would be penalised for doing so. You would lose money, but it would be possible to get some out, which partly resolves that roadblock. You can save up to £4,000 a year in a lifetime ISA, and there's 25% for the government bonus. So that's a free £1,000 every year, and you can either keep that in cash or invest it in the stock market. Obviously, if it's a long-term savings goal, then the stock market is probably going to be a better idea than keeping it in cash. And then the final thing I would say is for people who are running their own limited companies. Now, this has been a huge disadvantage for you in the pandemic, because limited company directors, by and large, haven't been able to receive any of the financial help that the government has directed self-employed people. And many consider themselves to be self-employed, even though they've got their own company. But there are pension advantages. If you have got a limited company, you can theoretically make an employer's contribution to your pension. It's something to speak to your accountants about. Again, there could be advantages there if you're doing it. And with all of these things, even if you start doing it at a small level, if you're doing it consistently over time, then that money is going to build up. So all is not lost for the self-employed, but yes, you do have a much tougher hill to climb, unfortunately.
Now, we're going to come back to questions in a moment, but Jo, I'm very keen just to look at this third leg of what we want to talk about in this session before we answer all the great stuff coming in, which is what more can we do to help the young people retire with a decent income? So one thing that's been a great debate in Westminster over the past couple of years has been the pension triple lock. This was a policy introduced by the coalition government with the Conservatives and Liberal Democrats, and the idea was to tackle pensioner poverty and make sure that pensions always climb, the state pension would always climb by 2.5%, the rate of inflation, is it interest rates? Have I got that right? Yes, I was trying to remember the three legs of the triple lock. It's obviously a hugely costly scheme. It's politically been very helpful for the Conservative Party and the Labour Party, which has already supported the triple lock. But given where we are with the public finances, with coronavirus, and the fact that it's just costing so much money, is that something that you think should go? And what other ideas do you think we should be looking at?
I'm probably going to say something unpopular here, and I don't think it should go, and I'm going to set out the reasons why. The triple lock currently ensures that the state pension rises by the higher of earnings, average earnings, inflation, or 2.5%. Now that has certainly lifted the UK state pension out of the doldrums where it was 10 years ago, almost 10 years ago since it was introduced. The fact is that the UK state pension on a pound for pound basis is still one of the lowest in the world of the advanced economies. So people retiring in the UK aren't doing as well in terms of generosity of the state pension. Secondly, there is about 10 to 15% of pensioners who are living in poverty. So it's not the case that we have every boomer retiring with a generous final salary pension. It's still something that is still a problem. But the main reason why I argue that the triple lock should stay in is because if you cut it, it's not the current pensioners who are going to suffer from this. It's the future pensioners who are going to have a less generous pension. I mean, it could go the 2.5%, which is that third pillar of the triple lock. You could cut it. And the triple lock might rise simply by earnings with everybody else and by inflation. But that would mean it would be weaker for pensioners in the next 10 years and the 20 to 20 years. And I think we need to have a decent state pension. I understand that and I acknowledge that it's costly, but the challenges for young people down the line are only mounting up. And if we have a weaker state pension, they're going to have to put more pressure on them to save privately. So I understand it's controversial, it's going against the flow, but I think we need to make the point that if you weaken the triple lock, you weaken pensions for future generations.
That is a really good point. Claire, what are your thoughts on the triple lock?
Well, I mean, one of my thoughts on the state pension, I mean, I don't want to worry people, but one of the reasons that I save so much into my private pension is because I'm 44 now, and I do wonder, by the time I'm of an age, well, I'll have to get to 67 before I can draw my state pension. Will it still exist in the same form then? Or will it be means tested? Will it be something that only the poorest in society can access? And I do fear that, the way things are heading, this is where it might end up. But I think the problem with changing anything to do with pensions, whether it's the state pension, whether it's the 25% tax-free lump sum that you can take when you start drawing on your pensions benefits, whether it's tax relief. Pensions, by their very nature, are long-term savings products. They're things that we expect to be saving into for a good 30, 40, maybe even 50 years, throughout our working lives, and increasingly now beyond. You leave your money invested in the stock market and draw an income from it. That's what today's retirees, by and large, are doing. If you make any changes to the rules, this affects people's level of trust with the pension system. And I know that one of the big issues for young people is, well, if I'm saving my money into this restrictive product called a pension, which I can't access until the age of 50 something, is being, funneled away for my future. What are the downside risks? What could happen to that money? Will there be a rule change? And I mean, just look at the student loan system. They changed the rules on those a few years ago. It took them a long time to, uprate that amount that you had to be earning annually before you had to start paying your loan back. At the moment, 30 years and your debt gets wiped. But I mean, that's something that I would be worrying about if I were a student today. Is that going to be changed in the future? So any kind of rule change could really knock people's confidence when it comes to pension saving. And as you've seen from our discussion today, the reverse needs to happen. We need to boost people's confidence when it comes to saving, to being confident that they can put money away today and it's going to give them a better tomorrow. With all of the risks and uncertainties that there are in the system at the moment, when it comes to the policy side of things, that's really never been more crucial.
Absolutely. Now, Joe, I just want to come back before we go back to questions again about this question of individual responsibility here. We've had quite a lot of people getting in touch saying, the UK has some of the lowest financial literacy in the OECD. And this is something that we've all talked about. People need to know more about this. And it feels as if that is going to necessitate more collective action on pensions. That, obviously educating people on financial matters is something that has to be done in school, has to be done throughout their adult lives. And that thing takes a sort of long time. And you can't really wait for that if you want people to be able to have a decent income to live on.
Yeah, that's the key point that I'm making. I think now with the pension system the way it is, with a shift to defined contribution, that there's just been too much loaded on to individuals. And they've got to deal with one of the biggest sort of dilemmas, and that is working out your longevity. I mean, no one's born an actuary and specific. I mean, that's beyond the capability of 95% of people who aren't actuaries, basically. So I think that education can help build people's confidence, but what's needed is someone to do the heavy lifting, the real heavy lifting of that financial mathematics and making sure those investment decisions and the decision about making that money pay a wage for life are not borne by the individual, who then would have to carry the burden of poor decisions. Let's face it, once you've retired, or you're got to the point where you can't work, you can't turn the Titanic around and start working again. So it's even more important that those decisions you're making are the best that you can make for yourself for later life.
Now, Claire, I'd like to just wind this out briefly to the big question of assets and people of the millennial generation here. And this was obviously something that Martin Wolf mentioned yesterday, where he was saying, that what sense does a pension investment make when asset prices are so high here? What's your view on that, and how do you strike the balance? If you look at things between buying a house, investing in a pension, obviously you want people with the millennial generation to start to get some financial security. And when you look at the various polls and things, I think it does come across as the most insecure generation since the opinion polling began in terms of their relationship to things that they do have. But it's not an easy solution to fix, because many of them, if you take housing, for example, are due, particularly in London, the southeast, to a fundamentally broken market.
Yeah, so I can see in the comments somebody has said, what hope is there for Generation Zombie with no access to parental capital, whether that's for a housing deposit or, to inherit in the future and solve your pensions crisis later in life? Well, it is tough. So let's talk first of all about the Martin Wolf point, which is about assets and, investing in assets. Now, obviously, investing in the stock market and stock market linked products is risky, but there's also a risk if you leave that money tied up in cash. Now, I don't know if I can reach them, but I've got some premium bonds up here somewhere on my desk. I can't find them immediately.
This is very on brand. If you didn't have premium bonds just in reach, I'd be very disappointed.
They were the reason I've got them is they're very beautiful little certificates from 1977. They were bought for me when I was a baby. Various different ones. The sum total paper value is £7. Now, that they're 44 years old. How much money are they worth today? The answer is £7. Now, back in 1977, £7, you know, I mean, you could probably, you know, go to the pub for a week on that on that kind of money. Whereas today, you'd be lucky if it bought you 2 pints in London. So the point I'm making is, you know, yes, there is an investment risk to using any kind of product, whether it's pensions or stocks and shares ISA. But then the risk if you leave your money in cash, you know, there's also a risk. So you have to think, well, you know, what is the system that has worked well over the past, you know, 50, 60 years for the majority of savers? You know, do I trust that will be a better result, produce a better result for me than just, you know, sticking cash under the mattress or leaving it in a savings account? The reason why I think it will is also to do with those tax advantages that we've talked about, and the fact that pension schemes are set up for employers to pay into alongside you. Now, of course, that doesn't help the self-employed who don't have an employer. But if you're looking at the other question you asked, which is, how do I balance saving for a property deposit versus saving for a pension? Now, that is a really, really difficult question, and it's going to be difficult in different ways for different groups of people. Now, we know that certainly in London and the South East, the vast majority of first-time buyers have got help from the so-called bank of mum and dad, or it could be bank of gran and granddad. It could be, you know, coming from both sides, from parents and grandparents to help children onto the property ladder. And if you don't have that, really your chances of getting on to, you know, being able to buy a property in the more expensive parts of the UK are toast. And that was covered yesterday. At the same time, you've also got the enormous cost of renting a property. And one trend I think that we're going to see a lot more of is multi-generational living, where families, you know, people are staying at home for longer, maybe having children, living in the family home, you know, raising a family with their parents on hand, perhaps for the, you know, the nursery of granny and granddad. Also does quite good rates, I believe. You know, these are all complications that are being forced onto this generation. They're having to make big trade-offs, you know, big choices in a way that previous generations just haven't had to. And I can totally see that pension saving may come at the bottom of a very long list of priorities. But all I would urge people who are listening to the session today to try and do is just put something in, even if it's just the minimum amount that your employer will match. You know, try and recalibrate your budget so that you can afford to do that and save some money into your property fund. A little thought of hope. I heard last week one of the big asset managers, they've just employed somebody who lives in Sheffield to do a job that would traditionally be in London, even though that person can only actually travel down to the London office of this big asset manager in the city around once a month. So that person in a cheaper location is getting paid a London wage because that person had the digital video skills that employer so desperately needed. And they did a great interview. I'm sure they asked the question at the end about how much will you pay into my pension, which you're all going to ask forever in the future from now on. But it just gives you a little bit of hope to think, okay, well, this provides some opportunity if we can work from home, live in cheaper locations and sort of commute to the office on a weekly rather than a daily basis. Maybe that is something that's really going to transform the working lives in the next few years.
Now, just before we go back to the questions, there's one last point I want to pick up with Joe here. In the FT's editorial this week, where we talked about the collective ideas we've discussed here, one element of this as well, of course, is that it can definitely help women do better in collective pension schemes. And this is obviously to do with the disparities in how they can work and the gender pay gap as well. Is there any difference between men and women in terms of how they are contributing to pensions and how the various schemes help or benefit either sexes?
Really good question. I'm glad you picked that one up. Currently, there is a gender pensions gap in this country of around 30%, and that is similar around the world. And the reason why that it exists is because women have more broken careers and because we're not earning the same. There is a gender pay gap, which translates into a gender retirement gap. Now, with CDC, the problems are we're not females, Sheilas, aren't saving enough. So they're turning up to retirement with smaller pension pots and facing another challenge compared with blokes, and that is that we tend to live longer. So we need to make that small pot last longer than men, because we typically live 2 to 3 years longer. So women have got much steeper challenges. That mountain for a female is much steeper to climb on their own. With CDC, with the collective pension scheme, the advantages are that the scheme is making the investment decisions. Now, there is some evidence from Australia, which has been a pure D system for many years, that women are too conservative. They don't take the risk that they need to take on in life with their investments to drive those returns. So they're just too cautious. Subsequently, they get to retirement with smaller pots. With a collective scheme, the collective scheme makes those decisions, and it can afford to take more risk because there's a bigger pool of money. But I think the crucial benefit of CDC for women is that you get a pension for life. So it's not up to you to try and make that small pot last. That pension will keep on paying, which makes the crucial difference for people who have got longer life expectancy.
Right, thank you very much for that. So that's really, really good points there. Let's try and rattle through some more of the questions. One that struck me, Claire, is this question about who to trust on financial decisions. Now, of course, I would very much trust you, and many readers of the FT Weekend do as well. But you also can obviously blame me when it all goes wrong. But it is a really serious question, though, when, you know, you can Google, before I did this session, I just Googled, you know, what should I do with my pension? And half the stuff that comes up is sponsored adverts for people promoting their own particular products, which obviously I don't necessarily want to go with that as well. And my Google rankings are a bit biased. I got lots of FT articles, but a lot of it is people just trying to promote their own stuff. So how can you advise people to look for sources that are A, knowledgeable, and B, are disinterested and objective, and therefore, because they've got to be trustworthy? And I think that's another thing that adds to your word cloud of people not being sure, because who do they listen to?
Well, exactly. And I would add a C to that to make the question even more difficult, which is that they can afford. Because the biggest problem for pension saving in the UK, apart from you know, our general, well, I don't like to say levels of ignorance about it, because I think part of it is the pensions industry's fault itself. You know, it wants it to be complicated. It likes to hide behind all of this jargon so that we don't ask questions about fees, and also it suits a lot of people in the financial advisory profession who we then have to pay to explain it all back to us. But one word one word up for the pensions industry. You know, a lot of the complications are caused by the government changing the tax rules. You know, that's something that's affected you know, very, very large numbers of doctors in the NHS, as Joe will tell you, who've like come up against this upper limit of their pensions where this horrific tax charge applies. You know, before the pandemic, lots of them were refusing to work extra hours because, you know, it meant that they'd actually be paid less because of this quirk in pensions taxes. So there's all kinds of horrifically complicated things in the system. But when it comes to paying somebody to advise you, it really is only those who are earning way above the national average wage who could ever hope to afford to do that. Now, it's not an advert, but last week there was a bit of a tremble in the financial advisory world, because Vanguard, who I described in my column, I'm sure they won't thank me for this, as the equivalent of Ryanair in the financial services world for their low cost, no frills service. They have entered the pensions advice market, and they are offering to you know, look after, invest your pension in their passive funds, and provide you advice on those difficult tax questions, amongst others, for around half the rate, or less than half the rate, that most of the big firms who currently are doing that in the market offer. Now, there's quite a few caveats to that only help people who are in the build up to retirement, what advisors call in the accumulation phase, because you're accumulating all of your assets and savings, as opposed to when you've actually retired, and then they call that the decumulation phase, because you're, you know, spending it all. But nevertheless, that really could be a game changer for the pensions advice industry for wealthier people in the UK, because the minimum you need to do that is £50,000 in your pension pot, which I do appreciate that some people who are watching this will think, well, you know, I just haven't got that amount of money. But it is an interesting step. Nearly every financial advisor, if you are looking for one, will give you your first consultation free of charge. They're all doing it online nowadays. My advice to you, if you're in the market for an advisor, would be ask your friends and family who they use. Again, the pandemic has made it much easier to access financial advisors who are maybe based in a place that you don't live. Like my own financial advisor, for example, is based in Northampton, not in London. I chose him because he's somebody who I know and I happen to like him very much, and we get on, come from similar backgrounds. That was very important to me when I was choosing somebody. But also the fact that he's not based in London means that his fees are about half the amount that somebody who's based near the FT office, for example, would charge. So definitely do shop around and have a look. And then my final thing, again, not intended as an advert, but you do need to educate yourself somewhat about these things, even if you're using an advisor, because you need to be able to understand what they're telling you. You need to be able to interrogate them and ask some questions. So the whole of the FT Money section at the weekend, I've been a part of it for more than 5 years now. Joe has been a part of it for even longer. You know, the whole premise of that section is to help educate readers about how to get the most out of their own money. What are the questions that they should be asking? What are the popular opinions, whether that's about investing, Merryn Somerset Webb, or fantastic investment columnist, or whether it's about the more sort of like practical, how do I do it stuff, which I tend to major in. But you know, there's so much advice out there which is of a good quality in the national media. We're quite well endowed in the UK for personal finance sections. You know, even if you read personal finance sections in another newspaper, you know, there's lots of really good people out there who can teach you the basics.
I'm just going to start interrupting because there's a couple more questions I want to rattle through in our final few minutes. Joe, there's two that I've picked out that I'd like to just run by you. The first, if I can just find it here, which is that, yes, young people are increasingly interested in ESG, and obviously schemes often require an active switch to a socially responsible investment strategy. So, you know, how do you think default strategies can better cater to younger people who are concerned about that? And the second question I wanted to ask you about, which is, do you think that the best option for saving for a pension is through the employer and the benefits of the offer, or the default, I know this is a very broad sweeping question, is to look for better rates elsewhere?
Thank you. I'll race through these because I know we've only got a couple of minutes left. But on the ESG question, pension funds have been slow. They haven't been moving fast enough to respond to consumer demand for greener options in their pensions. We've only got one net zero pension scheme, workplace scheme in the UK that caters for workplace pension savers. In the last couple of years, more pension providers have started to offer ESG/ethical options, but you really can't find them in the main in the default fund. You will have to go outside the main employer fund to find them. I think things will change in the next 5 to 10 years as there's more pressure on employers and providers to provide those options. And on the second question of whether it's better to save into the workplace pension or to go somewhere else, I would say the advantages of staying in the workplace pension is that there is a charge cap on what you get, and the ceiling is 0.75%. They can't charge you any higher than that. Typical fees in a workplace pension are much lower, below 0.48. If you go outside, you could pay much higher than that. And the second benefit of being in the workplace pension is that there is a layer of governance through trustees or through an independent governance committee that you don't get in a retail fund or provider outside the workplace pension scheme. That's not to say just on charges that you could get something competitive below 0.75, but you do have that layer of your employer and the governance looking after you in the workplace scheme, which you won't get outside.
Great, thank you very much, Joe. And I'm just seeing if there's any other of the main topics that have come in from our questions that we haven't quite covered. I think one theme there is coming through a lot of these is this uncertainty about the future. And this is, I think, something we've touched on again and again, trying to convince people that, you know, what is the jobs market going to look like? What are assets going to be worth in 50, 60 years' time? And you can see when millennials have been through, this very difficult generation following the financial crash, following the problems with the housing market, when they've got much less stable forms of work, the fact of saying you've got to think of this long thing in the future, how do you really put your eyes to that? So just to conclude from both of you on that thought, what is your case to make to young people that really you should think about the future and how you should go about it? Claire, do you want to take us off first?
Sure. My solution would be a mathematical one. The younger you start with pension savings, the smaller the amounts you'll need to put in to get the same result at the end if you started at the age of 40. Apologies to anybody who is watching this in your 40s. But if you were to start in your 20s and pay in, a small sum, imagine like a snowball at the top of a mountainside, that you could conservatively expect that money to grow over time. The magic of compound interest that we've been talking about. So it doesn't have to make that much of a dent into your pay packet in order to be worth something significant by the time you come to hang up your hat and stop work. And of course, if you're getting those benefits we've talked about, the tax relief, the employer's contributions on the way, then that's only going to build your snowball a bit faster. So do look into these things. Don't be afraid. Follow me on Instagram, listen to the Money Clinic podcast, and we'll help explain things in a non-jargony way that you can understand and take action with.
Exactly. You need to go and live in Claire Bauer's head. And in our last couple of minutes, Jo?
I'd say endorse everything that Claire said, but I will say that politicians are not dealing with the retirement crisis that is coming. They're not dealing with it because it's too far away. So you really do need to take steps. Don't bury your head in the sand. It's really important to save early and start saving adequately. The ideal rate is between 10 and 15%. And if what we've suggested in the form of collective pensions do start to take hold in the UK. There is one scheme that is launching it. There's 140,000 workers with the Royal Mail who are going to be offered a collective pension. In the next few years, if there's interest and drive from your employer, you can ask your employer about one of these schemes, then they could become more widely offered and offer a better solution for the young men.
And the same with ESG. Go to your pensions rep, speak to the HR department, that's what they're there for. Go and make use of them. Tell them, why haven't we got an ESG option? Go to our pension provider and tell them we want one.
Great. Well, I'm going to have to stop you both there, but that's with excellent advice. I think basically save early, save often. Don't shy away from it. That's the conclusion of this session. Claire and Jo, thank you so much for your wonderful insights. Thank you, everybody listening, for these great questions. And I hope you've enjoyed this session. You can obviously find out many more about our New Deal teams at newdeal.live.ft.com. And as we were just saying, to buy the FT Weekend, read FT Money, enjoy all of our output, learn more about this. Thank you very much for your time.
Thank you. Thank you.
For more than 200 years, Charles Stanley has been helping individuals, couples and families achieve their financial goals. Today, we're one of the UK's leading wealth management firms, providing high-quality, personalised financial planning and investment management services. With the world changing at such a rapid pace, how people think about and approach their finances has evolved considerably. And yet carefully considered planning and an open family dialogue about building and managing wealth are often overlooked or left too late. This can leave you and your family exposed to an uncertain financial future. That's why we believe it's never too early to organise your investments and implement a comprehensive financial plan. Our approach is to focus on you. We take the time to understand your ambitions, your concerns, your attitude towards risk, and your preferred way of working. Then we custom build a service around a single focal point, one that's right for you. Whether you're looking for financial planning and investment management services for the first time or thinking about changing your existing arrangement, we'd like to talk to you.